Right now, Europe and the US are moving in opposite directions on diversity and patient voice in clinical research. And if you're running clinical trials in Europe, that isn't just politics, it's a competitive window. So in this video, I want to talk about why regulators here are doubling down on the patient experience and inclusion, and why the US is pulling back, and how that creates a chance for European sponsors and CROs to lead rather than follow. Over the last couple of years, we've seen a clear split emerge. In the US, there's been a visible backlash against diversity and equity work. Major companies have watered down or removed some of their public D&I commitments, and diversity requirements in some areas are being challenged or softened. However, in Europe, the direction of travel is almost the opposite. Regulators and public funders keep coming back to the same questions. Who actually gets into these clinical trials? Whose lives and outcomes are reflected in the data? How do we make sure medicines are tested in populations that look like the ones who will end up using them? And that's not framed as ideology, it's framed as scientific quality and public trust. And you can start seeing this in the landscape right now. Regulators have started to formalize expectations around patient experience data and patient preferences in development plans. We're also seeing big public-private initiatives designed specifically to tackle representativeness and inclusion in European clinical research. At the same time, there's a push to make Europe more attractive as a place to run clinical trials, faster approvals, more coordinated approaches, but with inclusion and patient relevance as part of the competitiveness story, not separate from it. The message to sponsors is pretty simple. If you want to be here, you need to show that your clinical trials are designed for and accessible to the people who actually live here. So what does this mean if you're a sponsor or a CRO planning phase 2 or phase 3 work in Europe? Firstly, it means that patient voice is no longer a soft optional extra. It's becoming part of what de-risks a program in the eyes of regulators and payers. Secondly, it means that doing the bare minimum, a few advisory boards, a bit of outreach to the most visible patient groups probably won't be enough. And thirdly, it means that the organizations who build real capability around patient experience evidence, particularly for underserved communities, will be better placed to justify their trial designs, recruit more efficiently, and argue that their data truly reflects the populations Europe cares about. In other words, this isn't just about avoiding problems, it's about building an advantage. However, there is a risk here that doesn't get talked about enough. Many global development strategies and playbooks are still heavily influenced by US market dynamics and US political debates. If European teams quietly adopt the same pullback from diversity mindset, while regulators and public opinion here continue in the opposite direction, you end up in a very dangerous place. Programs will be designed with one culture and a set of assumptions in mind, but being assessed and funded in a completely different environment, with regulators and payers asking questions those programs were never built to answer. And that can show up as more scrutiny, more questions about who's in your data, and more pressure to demonstrate relevance to groups who were never really considered in the original design. The flip side is that Europe doesn't just have a challenge, it has an opportunity. So if you're a sponsor or CRO willing to lean into this, you can position yourself as the partner who can run inclusive, high-quality clinical trials in European populations, the team that understands how social and structural realities shape participation and outcomes, and the organization that can generate evidence regulators and payers in this region are actively asking for. And that's a story you can tell not just to regulators, but to patients, clinicians, and health systems who are increasingly sensitive to who gets left out of research. In a world where others are stepping back from this work, stepping forward is a way to stand out. So when we talk about patient voice infrastructure, we're not talking about a slogan or a campaign. We're talking about practical things like established relationships with communities who are usually underrepresented, trusted ways of gathering longitudinal real-world insight from those communities, and the ability to turn that insight into evidence that can shape protocols, recruitment strategies, and market access plans. It means moving from one-off engagements to a more continuous understanding of how different groups actually experience conditions, treatments, and health systems. That kind of infrastructure isn't built overnight, but teams that start now will be in a very different position in 2 or 3 years' time to compare to those who wait until requirements become explicit and urgent. And this is exactly the space Unwritten Health works in. We focus on underserved communities across Europe, the people who are often missing from the clinical trials, but deeply affected by disease and by the way health systems work. Through long-term community partnerships and structured methods, we help sponsors and CROs see how proposed protocols collide with real lives in different contexts, understand what makes participation possible or impossible for specific groups, and build development plans that reflect the lived experience regulators and payers are concerned about. We're not here to run your clinical trial operations. We're here to give you the insight and evidence that help you design programs which work scientifically, operationally, and socially in the European context. So just to bring it all together, the US is pulling back from diversity doesn't make the topic go away. It just means Europe has to decide what kind of clinical research ecosystem it wants. For sponsors and CROs who are willing to align with where European regulators, funders, and patients are heading, there's a real chance to lead by treating patient experience and inclusion as core parts of clinical development, not as side projects. If you want to stay close to how this is evolving and how to build the capability in a practical way, you can follow along on LinkedIn or subscribe to my YouTube channel.